Hello guys, welcome to another Boost Knowledge video, and yes, today we're continuing our history line and talking about Tudors. Last video was about Queen Elizabeth I. Wait, no! It was about the Protestant Reformation. But if you do want to learn about Queen Elizabeth I or anything before them, do check out our playlist. And yes, if you started watching this video, please don't stop there, because you're going to learn some very interesting stuff. Look at the picture displayed on the screen. Because sometimes in history exams you do have to look at pictures and text and wonder, what the hell is it talking about? And in this picture, you can see a person on the left and a person on the right. The person on the right might be of lower class, his clothes aren't as fancy, and he seems to be kneeling down asking for something. The person on the left seems to ignore him. Maybe the person on the right is annoying him. Or maybe he just doesn't care. And look at his clothes, fancy. He looks quite rich. Well, if you guessed all of that, you're very close to the correct answer, because this picture is about a rich person ignoring a poor guy, which is the person on the right, obviously. But why is this occurring? What was society like at that time? Well, it obviously wasn't equal, so let's talk about the social hierarchy of the time. There were actually four classes of people. The gentleman, who is literally the person on the left. They owned lots of people. They sometimes even helped the monarch rule, and they had loads of land. Seems good to be a gentleman, right? Like medieval times, although we didn't talk about it in this video. If they're like bishops, the kings, the bishops, and the knights, the barons and the knights, gentlemen are sort of like the barons and the knights, because kings don't be in the kings aren't in this list, and they make up about 5% of the population. Citizens are like merchants. They have townhouses, and most of them have servants. They make up 5% of the population. So they're like they're like peasants working very well, but they sell things. So for example, one text quoted a citizen, seems to be a strange name to call a group of people that only makes up of 5% of the population. The citizen said he buys barley and wheat from a farm and then sells it in London and gets money from it. So, well, the last sentence was made up. But, well, this is how the sentences were like. Well, good, right? The third class was the yeoman. Y-E-O-M-E-N. What literally meant farmers. But, like, higher ranking farmers who owned or borrowed the land, owned it or rented it. Land. Like, owned the land or rented it. They had a farmhouse, they obviously had a good living. Sometimes they employed people to do their work, sometimes they did it themselves. They had cattle, pigs, and sheep, they grew lots of wheat, they got lots of money. And they made up of 30% of the population. Look at the first three classes, 5%, 5%, 30%, gentlemen, citizens, yeomen. And you might say, this is quite good. Or is it? 40% of the population are living a good life, but what about the rest 60, which were the laborers, like peasants? They worked for yeomen, sometimes for citizens, and they did hard labor. Sometimes they lived well, maybe they get a good salary from their yeomen, some they get like good life, sometimes they're given lots of money, sometimes their rulers, people above them treat them fairly, maybe they like the job, but sometimes they didn't. Mostly, not mostly, but in some significant cases, people were unemployed and very poor. In Elizabethan London, London was the richest home for the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor, which were the highest of the gentlemen and the lowest of the labourers. But wait! Lowest of the labourers. And this introduced another class, the paupers, or like very poor people. Well, I mean, it's the poor paupers are in the class of laborers, but they're not. I'm not saying they're another class because I'm saying they're another class because they're the extremities of the laborers, paupers, and like now and then, every society had to deal with an extremely poor population, and people have different ways of doing it. I'm not criticizing or saying that any way is good, but just to list some ways. For example, just let them be be like that. Provide funds, offer them work, get them in the government, get them in the government. Maybe even raise taxes to support them. Maybe bring them out to some city life or something like that. Because there's many things you can do, but the worst thing is to not do anything. But that's not the worst thing. The worst thing is to punish them for being poor. Which was exactly what Wait. I don't think anybody did that, did they? Well, before we say whether anybody did that or not, let's look at the 1601 Poor Law, which categorized all paupers, into four groups, who had no jobs, obviously. Poor children, they were given work. The sick and very old poor people, I mean actually sick, they were given funds. Poor adults, which could work and were hardworking, proven to be hardworking. They were getting work in exchange of food and drink. But lazy paupers who were like, "Oh, I don't want to work. I didn't get funds. My body is completely fine. I don't care. I just need money." The law treated them quite harshly. They were whipped and sent back to where they came from, and well, had to go to work. But if you look at the law here, as long as you're not lazy, well, you can't expect money just going flying your hands. It was actually quite fair. But for a long time, they weren't. For example, when Henry VII was ruling, Henry VIII's father, the first Tudor monarch, we don't learn about him much, but we do know that he was the person who poured out of the Wars of the Roses and was like, "I'm king!" But he treated the beggars quite harshly. They were put in stocks, which would trap them, and then thrown back to their birthplace, which was quite harsh. When Henry VIII was ruling, people who did not cheat, who were not scammers, people cheated scammers? Well, we'll talk about that later, but, well, people who were actually poor, they had the license to beg, but if they didn't have the license, they were whipped. Still doesn't solve their problem, because being allowed to beg, doesn't mean you have money. When Edward VI was there, he was actually worse than his father. Beggars were whipped and sent back. Sometimes they even became slaves for 3 years, but it was reduced to 2 years because it was too harsh. We do not know what Bloody Mary did or Mary I did, but we do know that Elizabeth I raised local taxes to help all poor. Beggars were punished, but they were offered work, so they could work if they wanted to. Although if you didn't want to work, you were punished, which this is exactly what the Poor Law said. And the Poor Law was introduced when Elizabeth I was queen, which was good. So this gives you a very brief understanding. It's quite a thorough understanding actually of what the poor was like. Well, you might just say, well, they were treated badly at first, but then when the Elizabethan Golden Age came, they were treated quite well. But wait! When you're poor, you can't have funds. You're close to the verge of starving to death. You have no money, no law to help you. If you beg, you are whipped. What do you do? So this might seem like a riddle, but it's actually quite straightforward. The solution is actually quite harsh. 1, look for work. But if you can't do that, beg. But you can't beg. What about scam the population? So scammers appeared. Well, scammers have already appeared for a very long period of time, but at this time there were loads of scammers because there were loads of poor people. Like, laborers themselves made up 60% of the population, and even if a fourth of the laborers were poor, only a fourth of the laborers were poor, that's still 15% of the population. So that's more than the gentlemen and the citizens combined, which made a lot of problems. But why would people become poor? Because people have had jobs before the Wars of the Roses, after the Wars of the Roses. I mean, some people did not have jobs, but most of the population, like 80%, they still did have jobs, right? And this all comes back to Henry VIII, because he closed a bunch of monasteries and forbade, which means to forbid, bishops and barons to keep private armies because he doesn't want the Wars of the Roses again. So people found themselves fired, and then caused more people. Henry VIII, you bad boy. And these people, either they got whipped, either they found another job, either they begged and did not get caught, but then they became steady beggars, because they found ways to trick and scam other people. So let's talk about the ways people used to scam people. So firstly, there's this Bristler who uses some equipment to bet with other people. But the equipment is biased. So, for example, if he has a dice that always lands on 5, and he says 5 every time, well, he wins a lot of money. I mean, this type of Bristler, you can't blame them. Actually, in some casinos and places you're actually allowed to gamble, like, is it San Francisco? Sorry, I forgot. And Macau, some of the organizers actually are not that nice and make sure you lose every bit of money you have, which is sort of what the Bristler does, so you can't blame them, but it's still not a very good thing to do. Another type would be to have violent fits, which means you vomit or vomiting, and people will take pity on them and give them money. Another type would pretend to bleed or actually spill blood on yourself, and people will say, "Oh, poor guy, let me give him 5 quid." And there was actually a person who was caught doing this, and he got 3 times what a laborer gets in a year, in a day. So what? Scammers actually get a lot of money. Why not scam? And other people would pretend to be mad and follow people. This actually works a lot well, because if you're barking and acting insane, people might find that very annoying. So they give you money to let you leave. And the last one is the worst one. You want to be tricked in. The first 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 4 would be to lose money, but in the last you would lose more than money. Lots of women would act in the gang. They're called the bare-top tricksters. They would act in the gang in women. They would trick men into buying them a meal, because they would take off some of their clothes. And some men would be tempted to buy them a meal just to see the things. And then the woman would rob them and beat them up, which is not nice. So these scammers, or violence makers, or terrorists, you might even categorize the last group, it was not nice. At that time, it was actually a big problem for the government. What did they do? Well, this comes back to what we said, because what Henry VIII did was that if you found without a license, you were whipped back and sent back, and that with the first you were whipped no matter what. And they were even called vagabonds, and sometimes even treated harshly as slaves. So, what? That's bad. But then Elizabeth I comes along and everything becomes good, because the government actually realized that some people were actually genuinely poor. Like this guy. in this picture. I mean, I don't know, I've never met him, but we can assume that he might be poor because he's trying to beg. So, Elizabeth I tax the poor, tax the wealthy to fund the poor. But if he didn't work, he would be whipped. But which is good. It's good because the poor now has salary because they have work. And this problem has ended because after Elizabeth I, during Elizabeth I, scammers were reduced because, people don't need to scam anymore because they're told, by the law, if you scam, you go in jail. You're against the law, you go in jail. If you don't scam and you are actually poor, the government will give you money to give you a steady living job. And that worked for most people who scammed originally because they had no money. And this ended the scammer crisis. And this is exactly what this video is about. The poor, the scammers, and the law. Which actually beat the government because the law didn't do much. Or did it? Well, whether it did or did not, I hope you had enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe for more. Check out our other videos because on Boast Knowledge we do nearly everything. And we'll see you next time.